Thank you, Madam Chair. It has been nearly 7 months since the fires and explosions ripped through Lawrence and Andover and North Andover in Massachusetts in a disaster that looked like Armageddon. A young man, Lionel Rondon, was killed. Dozens were injured. More than 100 homes and businesses were damaged or just plain destroyed. But the Merrimack Valley pipeline disaster was not inevitable. It was preventable. Over the past 7 months, I have led an investigation into this disaster with Senator Warren and the company responsible. I found that Columbia Gas made safety an afterthought, and the residents of these communities paid a big price. But our investigation has also uncovered that Columbia Gas's safety failures were enabled by woefully deficient federal rules set by the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. And these regulatory safety black holes meant that families in literally every community across the Commonwealth and the whole country cannot be assured that the natural gas pipelines running under their streets and into their homes are not ticking time bombs. This week, I introduced the Lionel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act with my colleagues, Senator Warren and Senator Blumenthal. This legislation is meant to prevent the next Merrimack Valley disaster from happening by strengthening pipeline safety standards and closing these regulatory loopholes. While I won't ask you to comment on the specifics of the legislation, I want to get your views on the existing regulatory gaps that allowed this disaster to happen. The gas industry worked to develop a system for holistic safety management known as a pipeline safety management system. The American Petroleum Institute recommends that all companies adopt this safety strategy in order to continually improve their safety culture and decision-making. Many good actors in the industry have done so, but others, like Columbia Gas, have delayed adopting these systems and, as a result, didn't have a strong safety culture or an understanding of how to avoid disaster. To all of the witnesses, do you agree that all gas companies should have pipeline safety management systems? Yes or no? Mr. Elliott. All companies, yes or no?
So, Senator, thank you for the question.
Yes or no?
I can't answer that as a yes or no question.
Okay, Mr. Zumwalt.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, Mr. Amato.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Administrator Elliott, do you agree that PHMSA should require companies to develop these safety systems? Yes or no?
I think PHMSA needs to ensure that the recommended practices that are in place to assure compliance with safety management systems is something that should be required, yes.
Yes, it should be required. Yes, Mr. Zumwalt, should it be required that the companies develop the safety systems?
In my opinion, yes.
Okay.
And we have required that in aviation for commercial aviation. It's required there.
Thank you.
And my fear is that there'll be two different levels of safety.
Okay.
There'll be those who want it and those who don't do it. So I believe we need a requirement.
You can't give them a choice. It's either safety or not safety. We just saw that with Boeing. They were able to shortchange the safety measures which they actually had to pay for. Mr. Amato, yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, Mr. Baric.
O'Rourke.
Rourke, I'm sorry.
We would have to see how it's written, sir, before we could commit to it. We think that safety management systems can be implemented effectively without regulation, though.
Well, again, voluntary is fine for good companies. Voluntary is terrible for bad companies. So what are we going to do for the bad companies? Are we going to mandate it or not?
I think we need to look at the legislation, sir.
That's not a good answer. We just see what happens. We see what happens in airlines. We see what happens. If you don't have bottom line safety standards, you get a mess on your hands. Professional engineers, the National Transportation Safety Board investigation found that only one underqualified field engineer signed off on the construction plan that led to the Merrimack Valley disaster and did so without an accurate understanding of the setup of Columbia Gas pipeline system. As a result, the NTSB recommended that Massachusetts require that a professional engineer review and approve all pipeline engineering work. Chairman Zumwalt, do you think that all states should require that professional engineers sign off on construction work plans?
We saw in Merrimack Valley what can happen when you do not have a professional engineer seal those plans. At the existing time, we're only focused on the Merrimack Valley investigation, but we also know that about half of the states do not require a PE to sign off on plans. So we felt it was very necessary after the fact in Massachusetts. There's still about half the states that don't require it.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate that. Now, Administrator Elliott, do you agree with Chairman Sumwalt that professional engineers should be required to review and certify gas systems engineering work?
Senator, I believe that the federal standards in place today require that there's appropriate oversight at every aspect of.
Should they be professional engineers, Mr. Elliott?
I think that the rules that exist today under federal law can include that. It doesn't say it specifically.
Should it say it explicitly, Mr.
Well,
Elliott?
and again, in the
We're
case.
right, we're going to rewrite, we're going to reauthorize the law. Should we put in that they have to be professional engineers?
Well,
Yes?
I mean, I read your bill and I understand
Okay.
very clearly what
Okay.
it says, and we're happy to have dialogue about how that would
Well, the
There-
dialogue is just, should they be qualified, or can we allow unqualified
Well,
engineers to
I
do the
think
work?
our regulations call for qualified individuals.
Can we write the word,
although it
can
does
we
not-
write the word qualified into the legislation with your permission?
Well, I think we're happy to work with you on the specific language.
Well, then you're not sure that it actually says qualified, and the qualified is required. That would be my conclusion. If you're still willing to work with us, I don't think your answer is actually responsive to the question. So we clearly are going to have a little bit of a battle on our hands in terms of ensuring that we tighten up these standards. It's an agency that clearly needs to have additional oversight, but we need rules and regulations that are put on the books that are going to guarantee that the steps which need to be taken are taken by law. So I thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd be more than willing to have a second round if that would be permissible.
Thank you, Senator Markey. We will.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Columbia Gas Company failed to have a clearly delineated process for reviewing and making changes to its pipeline system, which would make sure that someone at the company with a complete understanding of the pipeline system knew what work was being done and what dangers might arise. According to NTSB, this was a big factor in allowing the Merrimack Valley disaster to happen. Administrator Elliott, do you agree that all gas distribution companies should be required to have a written procedure for a management of change process in order to track and understand all changes to the pipeline system and ensure that they are adequately reviewed to ensure safety?
Senator, I would agree there probably needs to be some enhancements and clarifications to the federal regulations that deal with management of change.
So you agree that we should have a uniform standard in terms of how these companies have to respond?
Without further understanding of how our staff is looking at it, I can't answer that definitively. I can tell you that there is absolute room for clarification of the management of change standards.
Well, I think your staff, I wish they had briefed you because the regulations we have right now are clearly not strong enough. The NTSB found that Columbia Gas's management of change practices were woefully inadequate. We need to make sure that there is a clear process at every company for reviewing changes to the system so that disastrous plans are not carried out. The NTSB understands that. Your staff doesn't understand it apparently, but I wish that they did and that they had briefed you on that because that's a key question that obviously should have been anticipated for this hearing.
If I may.
Yes.
I mean, we do absolutely respect the opinion of the NTSB. We have for many years, and we appreciate the good working relationship that we have, but we also understand that the NTSB and the state are not complete with their investigations, and we typically will always wait for the full conclusion of the investigation before we move forward. And another
Well, I think
point-
it's difficult for us to then hear your testimony because this is the largest single catastrophe yet, and yet we're talking about marking up legislation, and you're telling us that you can't reach any conclusions on things that are absolutely obvious that went wrong. until after the NTSB finishes its investigation? I just don't think that's a good answer, Mr. Chairman. I think by now your staff should be sufficiently familiar, at least with the outlines of what went wrong, for you to stand here, for you to testify here today, and to tell us what your strong recommendations are to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
You just keep telling me you have to learn more, you have to learn more, you have to learn more, you have to learn more. Well, everyone in Merrimack Valley already understands what went wrong, and I don't understand yet why you have not figured it
But
out.
Senator, if I may, I will tell you that this was, I have absolutely no qualms. This was a monumental failure on the part of the operator. But the process did work here because we set those minimum standards. We have a certain dependency on the states that have the right to conduct inspections and do enforcement of interstate pipelines.
No, the thing is, we're the federal government. These are interstate pipelines. The question here is, do we just have a minimal federal standard that we expect the states and the companies to have to implement? Otherwise, we're just playing Russian roulette across the whole country, depending upon whether or not any one of the individual regulations or companies is in compliance. And that's just too dangerous a place to put the American people, especially with an expansion of natural gas across our country.
But the
people are going to
process-
want to know that this is safe.
The process worked as intended because the state, when the initial recommendations from the NTSB came out, for example, the state legislation enacted the law that said that a licensed professional engineer had to get them out. That's perfectly within the purview of the state, and they can take those steps, and we encourage those steps until we can do a more full analysis.
Mr. Chairman, the process did not work because PHMSA's process and regulations led to a disaster. Do you understand that? Your regulations, your processes led to a disaster. So do not tell me that they were adequate. We can see where the
Senator,
holes were.
I disagree.
Well-
I think that the federal regulations in place, if followed, would have prevented this.
Right, and obviously, that's why we have to come back and review the federal regulations. Why are they inadequate? Why didn't they work and then put in place the language that ensures that they do? And that actually goes to the question of qualified engineer. Okay, it goes to many of the areas that we have been speaking about so far. You keep assuming that somehow or other, some level below you figures it out. And it's your job to figure it out, Mr. Chairman. It's your agency's job to figure it out, not someone down below you at the state, not someone down below you at a local community level, not someone down below you at the company level. It's your job to figure it out. And you seem to continue to rely back here on the regulations are strong enough as long as people below in the system act upon it. So let's then talk about a good deterrent. And I know that the chairwoman asked about the impact of penalties and corrective action orders in changing company behavior, especially with performance-based regulations. We need stronger deterrence against bad behavior. Right now, the limits on penalties that can be levied against pipeline companies who violate the law or commit safety violations is entirely too low. The federal cap for a series of related violations is $2 million. That amounts to a slap on the wrist. It's a parking ticket for a company worth $8 billion, $10 billion, $20 billion. $2 million is a parking ticket. They might as well take the risk because they have avoided having to implement perhaps tens of millions of dollars worth of safety features because ultimately the penalty is only $2 million. So from my perspective, that's not a sufficient financial deterrent to ensure that companies like Columbia Gas are not cutting corners on safety. Administrator Elliott, do you agree that the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration could use additional leverage to ensure companies follow the regulations on the books, including an increased financial penalty?
Well, Senator, as you know, the penalties amount are set by Congress, and they were last changed in 2011. We use and have always used that penalty limit as one of many ways that we ensure widespread compliance.
In your opinion, is the financial penalty high enough right now to deter the conduct which we have seen in the Columbia case?
I think the penalties, along with other compliance actions we can take, make it adequate.
You think it's adequate? Well, I think ultimately that having to pay a parking ticket when you're a multi-billion-dollar company is not sufficient deterrent, so I can't disagree with you more in terms of your perception of how these companies operate. Mr. Sumwalt, do you agree that the penalty should be raised?
Senator Markey, thank you for the question. The NTSB does not in any way, form, or shape, or fashion get involved in penalties. That's not part of our purview.
Yeah, well, in my opinion, we have to raise these penalties tenfold or 100-fold. We have to make it something that really does punish the company. Otherwise, I just can't imagine that there's going to be any significant deterrence to their activity. Columbia Gas's 2 pressure regulating stations meant to provide redundancy in stopping a disaster ended up failing in exactly the same way because of poor configuration, allowing for a catastrophic pressure surge. Because of Columbia Gas's configuration, these fail-safe devices were designed, in fact, to fail. Minister Elliott, do you agree that federal regulation should ensure that there cannot be a common mode of failure for these fail-safe pressure regulating systems?
Yes.
You think we need a new federal regulation on that?
You didn't say, do we need a new regulation? You said, do we need to ensure that there's not a common mode of failure?
Do we need new federal regulations to ensure that
I think we need to ensure that there are in place the safety tools to make sure that the systems do not have a common mode of failure.
So that we need a federal regulation to ensure
If
that
there
happens.
is not clarity in the regulations today, then there needs further clarification.
He's done.
Okay, well, that is, to me, something that is very important because 4 years before the disaster, and let me yield back to the chair. I'm sorry, I've gone over my time with
Senator
your-
Markey, I let you continue because we were waiting for Senator Blumenthal, so you need to thank him.
With your indulgence, I thank you on behalf of Senator Blumenthal for allowing me to continue to consume the time so that he could arrive in a timely fashion.
And you also know that you can submit questions for the record.
And
as
I have a few more questions, if
I-
you would not mind, for the witnesses.
If you could submit those for the record after Senator Blumenthal's done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator